And welcome to the Integrated Interventions Podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Dundas. I'm the Director of Education. Joining us today across the table for me is Clinical Director Joshua Westby, and to my left, Chris Garrett. I'm glad that you guys could join us today. Executive Director, can't leave that out. Clinical services today is what brings us together. So I have a series of questions. We'll start with you, Joshua, and then we'll work our way around the room. Who is the clinical team comprised of?
Well, that's a difficult question to ask. If you're talking about licensed providers, our clinical team encompasses a therapeutic director in each state, as well as various therapists that work for the program that do different things from traditional in-the-room therapy to experiential therapy out in the field, kind of everything in between. However, our therapy team also supports the overall program and the mentors and the work that we do in the field as well. So really, everybody is kind of underneath that clinical umbrella.
What is the purpose of a clinical team in our setting?
Yeah, so our therapists help to understand mental health diagnosis and symptoms to be able to synthesize what that means when it comes to treatment interventions. Right? Our therapists are trained to understand that this is a mental health diagnosis, this is the treatment that's going to be best suited for that mental health diagnosis, and here's how we apply it in our residential or our transitional living program. And then they're going to help to give that common language to our entire staff so that we're all working towards those same goals.
Yeah, and you can also think of our therapists, our team of therapists, as trainers as well, and support for staff in the program. So staff always have the opportunity to reach out to our therapists and work through different scenarios and whether it's problems or successes with students. So they're a huge part of supporting the entire team, both employee-wise as well as student-wise.
What services are offered within that kind of clinical umbrella?
Yeah, so our therapists offer in the room one-on-one what we think of as traditional therapy, right? That one time a week, how are you feeling? What's working for you? What's not? How can we process this? What tools can we give to help support that? We wanted to mirror what that student is going to experience out in the world as an adult and interacting with the therapist. We can get a lot deeper than that, though. We can meet several times a week. We can meet in the home, in the community. And then our therapists also work in what we call experientially, right? Out in the world, applying these tools in real time. So a therapist and a student can be out on a kayak, on the water, hanging out together, and the kayak goes over. And the student starts to freak out because they don't want to be wet and they don't want to be cold and they don't want the kayak to flip over. And the therapist can be there in that situation and help that student to process through that this is a natural consequence of choosing to be on a kayak, and this is what that looks like and how to manage those emotions. We also have substance abuse counselors in both states. They're able to work towards those clinical goals that are around substance use disorders and addiction and that kind of stuff. So we have a wide range of clinical offerings that can meet the need of the student when they come into the program, pretty much no matter what their diagnosis is.
Yeah, one of the things that our therapy team does quite well and that we continue to improve on across the board is collaborating with our education team when it comes to helping students with not only the basic life skills and coping skills, but also other things that are kind of buzzwords within the industry right now, but also like really important skills to learn. When you think of executive functioning and the curriculum that the education team is putting together for that, there's a cross with the therapy team when it comes to that sort of thing. So they may get some worksheets or different experiences through education that also cross over into the therapeutic relationship that they might have. And it might be the therapist that goes out with them that day to practice social skills. But they learned about social skills in their social skills class with the education team. So it's a lot of collaboration that we're working on. And ultimately, all that gets disseminated down to our mentors as well.
Yeah, and it isn't this expectation that therapists are the drivers of the treatment process while they're here at Integrated. Because in the real world, your therapist doesn't follow you around all day and say, oh, you should work on this behavior right now, or, oh, this is a trigger, you should watch out for those, right? In the real world, we go out and we experience and we come back and we talk about it in the room. And so our therapists very much are going to provide the opportunity for students to start to go out and use all these other resources in their world and then come back and report and say, I did really well, or I didn't do well, or this felt good, or this didn't feel good, or you gave me that worksheet to do and I didn't do any of it. Cool. Well, let's talk about why you didn't do it. Or you gave me that worksheet to do and I went with a mentor, we went somewhere really uncomfortable and I was able to fill it out and it worked really well for me. So we can adapt the way that the program responds to a student based off of how the student is utilizing the services that they have here.
Well, and that highlights too that the therapeutic experience is happening in ways that we may not expect.
Yep. Yeah. A big part of that is that coordinators are our treatment drivers. So a coordinator spends more time with students than any other person in the program, and they really understand what isn't working for this student. And they may not understand that this student argues with every person they meet, so here's the solution. But they come to treatment meetings and say, I have this student, they argue with every person they meet, and each person in each individual department, including our clinical team, can provide insight and guidance and make goals around that so that we're all working collectively together without it being the therapist who's in charge of the student's process, because that's just not true to real life.
Are there aspects to our program that are occurring here that you may not see other places?
Yeah, so our census, our caseloads per therapist are very low at Integrated, and that's done intentionally. Our therapists have a schedule where about 15 hours a week are blocked out in sections of needing to sit down and be in the office, and then a lot of that space is open to responding in real time to the program as things are happening. And because we're able to do that, it isn't Sally has a problem on Tuesday, but she doesn't have therapy until Monday, and so she doesn't get to talk about it again. It's Sally's having a difficult time on Tuesday, the therapist has an opening on Thursday, let's slide into that open spot. Or the therapist can add it to their rounds and show up at Sally's house and be able to process in a more comfortable environment. So we have that going for us that makes us pretty unique. The other thing is that we have therapists in both locations that don't have physical office space that is theirs solely. They share space when they need an office, but most of their work is done in their car, on the lake, in their house, wherever that student is engaging, at their place of employment or whatever that looks like. And because we're able to do that, we can come along side by side and work with our students in a way that feels very authentic to the student and is engaging and allows for us to utilize those therapeutic tools in real time.
Yeah, a big difference between us and other traditional residential facilities or programs is that, it's not, you don't have the therapist show up at the program house with 10 other students there and they take turns seeing one student after another, and they get piled on that way. And then they have to turn around and go and report to parents and then go and report to the treatment team and come up with this treatment plan that's driven solely by them. And Joshua talked about this a little bit earlier. They're a piece on this treatment journey. And we're really teaching students to utilize that piece for what it's for therapy, for your mental health. All the other parts of this, the other lines and levels, I guess you could say, may not have anything to do with therapy at all. They might have to do with other aspects of the student's life. So the therapist is there to drive the therapeutic relationship and to help teach those skills and engage with a student on that level, and then can support all the other things within the program, but they're not driving it. So that's a big difference that parents and education consultants will see in our program, is that you don't get a weekly update from the student's therapist. That's not a real life scenario. You'll get a weekly update from the coordinator who has their finger on the pulse of everything. And they'll be able to report whether that student's attending therapy or not. And that's about it, unless the program calls for more intervention on the therapeutic front and more support for parents. And that would be another conversation to have with the program for sure.
Yeah, when I was working with students on my caseload, it's always fun when they get surprised that I don't talk to their parents or I don't know their parents' names, right? And that's because my therapeutic alliance is with the student in our program, the same way that if I go to a therapist in the community, their alliance is going to be with me. And they're not going to call my parents and let them know how I'm doing. We want that separation because I want space for that student to come in and be able to have some really hard moments identifying, like, I've made a mistake of my life and I want to make a different change, which is a huge realization that a lot of our students have along their journey, right? That they've wasted a bunch of time by choosing to do what they've done or have been engaging in life the way that they have. And to provide that space for that realization, the student needs to feel comfortable to know that they're recognizing that it's not the world around them that they failed, but themselves. to be able to start doing the work on what they're going to change and what the future is going to look like. And if they think that the minute they leave, I'm just going to pick up the phone and talk with their parents, they're not going to trust me to be able to have those kinds of conversations. And the work that's happening in that therapy room, parents are going to see over time, right? As their student starts to engage differently, and has different perspectives and starts to grow into the adult that they're going to be the rest of their life.
Yeah, and it's very intentional that we set it up this way. I challenge anybody to find a study that shows that a specific modality is more important to treating an individual with mental health concerns than their relationship with the therapist and the trust with the therapist. It's the relationship and trust with the therapist that actually shows the most promise, the most results in the long run when somebody's engaging in therapy, not necessarily the modality. We're skilled in lots of modalities, and it's important to understand these things and to use different modalities when it's appropriate for a diagnosis. But the most important thing across the board is that relationship.
Can that be difficult too for parents that are used to a particular style of communication? Say if they're coming from an adolescent program where the model is historically driven by the therapist managing, and then they come to integrated where that's not the case. What challenges may lie in that process?
It's a big transition, right? Because like you said, in traditional adolescent programs, the therapist dictates everything. They set punishment, they give rewards, they get to decide if you see a movie or go out on rec time and all of those things. And I've worked in those programs and they're very successful at working with children, right? And adolescents. When we get into the age of transitional living, when we get into those 18 to 30-year-olds that are looking to launch into the world, it's not as successful. A therapist can't hold consequence that way because then they just become a cog in the machine and a tool to manipulate so that they can get their movie night or go out on rec time, which those things aren't really given as rewards here, right? They're earned as part of the process of being a young adult. But it is definitely a transition. And sometimes parents have a hard time letting go of the fact that the therapeutic process at this level is a lot more of a one-on-one therapist-student relationship that has a need for space so that the student can kind of navigate that on their own. The parents can't really be a part of that process anymore. Now, that isn't to discount family work that may be needed at some point, right? A student may have had a difficult time at home or said mean or inappropriate things. There's lots of space for when that student is ready to engage with the family unit to provide some kind of family services. But those are going to happen with a community partner. They're not going to happen with our clinicians here in the program. And that's also done intentionally so that a student has the opportunity to understand that this therapist is for me and my needs and kind of helping me through this journey. And this therapist is to help me to reconnect with my family and to engage in a way that's appropriate and healthy as a young adult should.
Yeah, and we oftentimes encourage parents to seek out parent coaches that are skilled in this type of situation, right? And I'm not talking about parent coaches that tell you how to parent your kid, but helping you transition to having a young adult in your life and how you can start treating them and how you start interacting with them differently and what to expect from that student who all of a sudden has a bunch of freedom that they don't know what to do with, so they lash out or maybe they take off and they're doing really well, but it's not in an area that parents feel like they should be taking off. I want my kid to be a doctor, not a lawyer. So it's those kind of things. So engaging a parent coach that's skilled in this arena is often very helpful. We've seen some really good things come from that.
And we can recognize it as a program too, that a lot of our parents, it's a trauma response at this point, right? They've just been trying to do the best they can to get to this moment in time with a child that they didn't have all the answers for, which is a really scary and difficult journey. And so a big part of what we do when we work with parents is helping them to understand that you can let some of this go now. You can take a breath. We can put this expectation on your young adult to make the decisions that they need to live a happy, healthy, productive life. And that with the guidance of the program and some time and the student being willingly engaged in the process, we can see some really good result from that.
How do you approach working with a student who is, quote unquote, maybe treatment resistant, isn't interested in therapy?
That's a really important question, and it's probably the one that I work with the most as the person who manages the clinical interventions for our program. Students who get to us generally have had years of therapeutic placements. So they have been through the process long enough that they either understand how to force themselves through the game, or they think they know the right answers to placate and just kind of, look, I did it, leave me alone. right? It becomes evident very quickly in our program that you can't do that. There is no winning therapy at Integrated, the way that there can be in adolescent programs where you can game the system. And so we get students who will then be like, well, if I can't win it, I'm not going to play. Leave me alone. Our therapists are trained on how to engage with the student to get them to the table. So one of the things that we tell students is I have to put my eyes on you one time a week. I have to see you. And if you don't come to my office, or if I don't see you in the house that we're supposed to, I'll show up at work. I'll come bother you at the park. Like, I have to see you. And I have to check in, make sure you're okay. And then that's it. And then we leave the rest of it in the wheelhouse of the student. And because we're able to do that, the first few weeks, the student may say, yep, I see you. I'm alive. Leave me alone. It gives us an opportunity so that when that student is having a difficult week, they can say, yeah, I see you. And also, I'm not actually doing all that fine this week, right? And they start to engage in the process. And because our therapists learn to engage, not to get the right answers, not to force a situation or to tell a student, if you don't participate in therapy, you'll never be able to leave, but because they genuinely care about the student and their progress, it leaves room so that those students can engage when they really need it, and they build meaningful relationship. And then that meaningful relationship turns into the work that they can do in the office. And that may take a couple of months for some students, but we have a really good track record of getting people to engage when they don't want to, just by giving them the opportunity to say no.
Yeah, not everybody in the outside world, outside of programs, goes to therapy every week. It's appropriate. You know, sometimes therapy isn't what's needed to help you in that moment. You might be doing really well for a while and you don't need that therapy, but knowing that it's there and knowing how to access it, those are the types of skills we're going to work on as well. What do you do when you actually do need a therapist? When has it been most helpful for you in the past? And if you can identify that, then we can find ways to help you learn how to engage in that process. So, yeah, they do a great job of that.
Yeah, and just because your student isn't meeting with, or just because a student isn't meeting with therapy one time a week does not mean that therapy isn't engaged in that student. Our therapists attend all of the treatment team meetings for all of our students every week. They're engaged in that process. And there's lots of times where a therapist is engaging with a coordinator and teaching a coordinator of a way to interact with a student, or helping mentors to understand a particular mental illness so that they can engage differently with the student. So that therapeutic element is still there from every person they interact with, even if they're not sitting in front of a therapist that week.
Really goes towards that idea that therapy just doesn't happen in an office or four walls. But that can be also hard to understand too, because that's a dynamic process that you're not seeing every day. Because I mean, you can think about someone being inside an office, but the fact that therapy is happening in community is also an interesting concept.
Yeah, insurance companies have taught us that therapy happens in an office, and it can only be 45 minutes or an hour. That's what insurance companies have taught everybody. Therapy happens all over the place, and especially with a skilled therapist in the community, you can get a lot of really cool things done in those moments of building connection and trust, and then actually allowing the student to practice things that you're talking about during those interactions. They trust it so much more.
Yeah, and I think about, armchair psychology, those dim lit rooms and the leather couch, and that how does that make you feel, and you write stuff down, right? The part of that they don't really teach the general public is that didn't really work in the 60s and 70s, right? You didn't feel a whole lot better. We'd prescribe drugs, and those would sometimes work, sometimes not. You would leave, and I would call your spouse and tell your spouse everything you just said in session and how they can help you navigate this life stressor by, I don't know, working less or vacuuming more or whatever that looked like. Armchair psychology doesn't really work. There's a lot of people who are going to very much disagree with me on that. But in today's age, therapy is a conversation between two people. It's dynamic, it's engaging, it's real to the person. And it has to be that way, because if it's not authentic, I'm just teaching you a bunch of tools that only work while you're sitting here in this room. And I want our students to be able to utilize the things that they're learning in the world, in real life, because that's where it matters most.
What are the differences and similarities between the clinical teams in Idaho and in Texas?
So that's a good question. In both locations, they're both managed by a director of therapeutic services. That person makes sure that treatment plans are being done, that students are engaging with therapy appropriately, the therapy team is educating the staff appropriately, all of those things. And then each location also has somebody in office that is more of that traditional in-office hour at a time session provider. Each location also has a substance use counselor or a substance use therapist that can meet with the student for those particular particular needs. And each location also has somebody who works in the community. So in Texas, we have an experiential therapist that works with students out in the field. And here in North Idaho, we do as well. The real major difference between the two states is that in Texas, in our traditional residential level of care, we have a therapist in that facility that has an office there that spends almost 100% of their time in the program at that one facility. But other than that, they're pretty much carbon copies of each other.
Today's podcast has been awesome, Joshua and Chris, because I've been able to learn a lot more about clinical services. I know a lot of the intricate pieces to it, but to be able to hear it directly from you, I think is always great. And to be able to kind of frame the perspective of what we offer both in Texas as well as Idaho. So I want to once again thank you both for joining us, and we look forward to the next time we get to meet.
Thanks, Patrick.
Yeah, thank you, Patrick.
All right. Well, once again, this has been an Integrated Interventions podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Dundas. Make sure to check us out on the web at www.integratedinterventionsllc.com, as well as all of our social media channels. Make sure to check them out: Instagram, Facebook, and all the things. Like, subscribe, etc. Look forward to seeing you next time, and thanks again.